Okay. So good morning, everybody. So it's a pleasure to start this day dedicated to modeling approaches. So we will discover what is modeling and what is behind this scientific approach. So if you looked at the program, you will just have this first general introduction to what is modeling and specifically why do we use model for crop protection. And after, you will have presentation of different examples of model. And after coffee break, then we will have methodological introductions to show you how to design models. Of course, it's very difficult to make you become modelers if you are really beginners in a couple of hours. But just to give you some insight on the techniques behind these approaches. And at the end of this session, you will have to develop by a group team your own modeling project. And at the end of the training course next Friday, you will be here in order to present your findings and share with everyone what is the outcome of your modeling projects. So I hope you are not too scared about that, and I think that Dr. Chuk will present what she did in Volterra in Italy, and I think it was a very nice example. Okay, so my talk will have two main objectives. First, to show you what is modeling, and second, to show you a set of examples on why do we use models in crop protection. So in order to better know who I'm talking to, who consider himself or herself as a modeler in this classroom? So I have one. Thank you, Philippe. Two. We have, oh, nice, three. So, okay, most of you don't consider themselves as modeler. And to my opinion, I think that most of you didn't provide a good answer, because even if you don't know it, I think that you are good modelers, actually. And I will try to convince you why this is true, okay? Because modeling has different meaning. So if I ask you the question, what is a model? How would you answer? Okay, so you say a general framework for prediction and simulation. And actually, for these two words, prediction and simulations, actually what lies behind is to represent reality. So modeling is the activity to design a representation of a real system. Of course, you cannot encompass the entire universe, so you will have to decide, okay, I will study a given system, this classroom, the camera, the computer, all this can be considered as a system that can be modeled. And actually, in the field of science, modeling is a very widely used activity in all types of fields. For instance, in meteorology, here you have a mathematical model that describes the sedimentation rate of water droplets in the atmosphere. So with that, you're able to predict what will be the weather and what will be the rainfall events and so on. So behind this type of model, you have some mechanistic, simplified representation of the reality in the field of weather science or climatology. Another example is what is called yield management in the transportation industry. You know, if you take a plane, usually all the passengers will have paid a different price depending on the timing where they decided to buy the tickets and so on. And in order to optimize the income for the traveling companies, they have models that will say, okay, this part of the world will be on vacation, so we'll have many customers wanting to travel from this point to this one, and they make predictions in order to adjust the price for their tickets. And at the beginning of these techniques, they made mistakes in their model. They forgot that, for instance, in the USA, they were on vacation for this specific period of time. and then their model was totally wrong, and they didn't have enough flight, and people were very upset because they could not necessarily get a seat in the plane. Another example is in nuclear physics. So here it's for peaceful applications, but especially in France we had some trials with nuclear bombs that were used to collect many data, and after we use models in order to predict what are the atomic reactions within reactors or within a process of bombing in order to predict how to manage that type of applications. And the last example in the field of biology, here you have, for instance, a particle of Escherichia coli, which is a few micrometer long, and some models were developed in the field of biology in order to represent more than 4,000 genes, 60,000 ribosomes, proteins, and all that type of interactions at the organic molecular level. So you can see that, and of course these are just simple examples, but any field of science can use modeling. So I would try now to present what are the main objectives of the modeling approach in a broad sense. So I think that the first reason why scientists develop models is to help decision making with regard to the management of a system. Before we heard the colleague who mentioned simulation as the output of a modeling activity. Well, is to predict the behavior of something that we are managing in order to make better decisions. Okay, so in our field, if we have a model that represents the behavior of an agroecosystem, we will be able to say, okay, if I apply this agroecological crop protection strategy, the behavior of the pest will be that way or on the other way, and in that way you will be able to take better decisions. So it's the first use of modeling. The second use is to teach and training. This is what we are doing now. When you have developed a model, it's a very nice way to teach students and colleagues or advisors in order to present a set of concepts and a set of knowledge that is embedded within a model. And also it's great to communicate. You know, yesterday I showed you some videos, and it's an example of how we can use models in order to communicate to other partners interested in the same system being modeled. Another important reason, it's this one, is to better understand the behavior of a system, because once you have depicted the behavior of a system, you can analyze by simulation its behavior, and in that way you will gain knowledge. And the last reason for modeling is to gather all the available knowledge in order to gather and make available this knowledge in a consistent way, and to identify knowledge gap. And if you have a knowledge gap, then you usually find a way to get the information by setting up experiments in order to produce this knowledge. Okay? So I think with these 5 main reasons for modeling, we cover the main objectives of this scientific activity. Would you have in mind other examples of why people are using models or developing models? Do you have any other ideas? So some definitions. We saw that a model is a simplified representation of reality. We need also another definition on what is a concept. Well, a concept is an abstract or a generic idea that is generalized from specific instances. Okay? And we will introduce something called a conceptual model. A conceptual model is a representation of the relationships between the underlying concepts of a system behavior. Okay? And when we say model, usually you can define two types of models. Conceptual models, where it's only a description, very simple, with arrows and circles with some keywords that traduce relationships. And then you have simulations model that can predict some quantitative or qualitative variable, and that permits to perform simulations. So now I will stress the difference between a conceptual model and a simulation model. Okay? So if we all agree on the definition of what is a simplified representation of reality as a model, then if we take figurative painting, it also can be seen as a way of modeling. So I don't know, do you know this famous French painting? It's called Gleaners by Millet. And he was a painter who wanted to stress the difficulty of the agricultural life for farmers. And do you understand the word gleaner? The gleaners, you know, it's when you go after the harvest in order to pick up and to collect the grains that are left at soil surface. So do you have that type of practice in Vietnam? Yeah? So, okay, we have this painting, and you can see that the colors are a bit dark here. The position of the bodies are not very comfortable, and it's to show that the life by that time was difficult for farmers. But if you have this painting, you can use another type of technique in order to depict the same situation. So it's exactly the same painting, but we used another painter used another technique. You can see that the colors are more bright, are lighter. The drawing is a little bit thicker, a little bit more naive. And with this, you can see that you have the same representation of the reality, but you use different techniques. Okay? And I wanted to stress another difference, because a simplified representation is just a point of view. It's a decision. There is no unique way of describing the process of gleaning. You can decide the way to represent it. So I show you another picture by another painter who wanted also to paint about gleaners. And you can see that the point of view is totally different, because here the ladies are straight, they are not bending, and they have full quantity of grain that is being taken from the fields. And you can see that the representation is totally different, because the point of view is totally different. So keep in mind that modeling is not something universal, it's a subjective representation. So each modeler will have its own representation of the reality, okay? And you can use different techniques. So imagine that the painter, whose name is Millet, was not a painter, but was a modeler. Maybe he would have decided, okay, I will not paint this picture of gleaners, but I will design a conceptual model to represent the process of gleaning. So maybe he would end up with something like this. So this is what is called a conceptual model. In green, you have the output variable that we want to model. Let's say the total biomass collected on the field. And then you can make some assumptions. You can say, okay, if I want to predict the total biomass collected on the field, it will depend on the number of ladies in the field, number of gleaners in the field. It depends on the field area. It depends on the working time during the day, and on the collected biomass by gleaner per unit time and unit area. And this depends on the physical fitness of each of the ladies and the number of grains left at soil surface after harvest, after unit area. So this scheme is called a conceptual model, okay? And now we can try to see how we can transform this conceptual model into a simulation model. For instance, if you have these concepts, then you can propose a mathematical equation in order to represent the process. So for instance, the biomass collected in the field can be simply the products of these variables. N is the number of gleaners in the field. Nu is the quantity of grain per lady per surface time and surface unit. S is the field area, and delta T is the working time. So here, it's how I translated a conceptual model into a static equation. It's a way. And like I showed here 2 techniques of painting, I can introduce another technique of modeling. You can say, okay, I would like to know at each time what is the biomass collected. So you can make a dynamic model showing the biomass of the field as a function of the same variable, except that you use an integration to account for the accumulation of biomass per each ladies. Okay? And for the same conceptual model, you can also use another technique. You want to say, okay, maybe I would like to represent what is going on a spatially explicit model. So you can say, well, here is my field. Each blue point represents a grain, and the 3 red circles will be the 3 gleaners. And you can make some assumptions saying that the grain distribution at surface after harvest is randomly distributed, and that you can perform stochastic simulations to represent the trajectories of each gleaner. So, you know, it's just something stupid to show you some examples, but it's nice to show that with the same conceptual model, you can derive a set of different equations to represent the process. So you can see that here, the 3 models that we have here, maybe I'll take this. Okay, these 3 models are like these 2 paintings. It's only just a difference of techniques. But what is common is the general conceptual model. I use the word stochastic. Do you know what does it mean? What is a stochastic model? It's a model which output will depend on the random variable. So if you run 2 times the model, you will not get the same results. And the opposite of stochastic is deterministic. If you run several times the model, you will get the same result if the model is deterministic. Okay? I will just come back to the ESR concept that you heard of yesterday. So remember, it's efficiency, substitution, and redesign when we want to reduce input in agroecosystems. Is it okay for these 3 levels? I will use them because I will show now a collection of examples in the field of crop protection which are related to each of the 3 levels of the ESR concept. So if we look at the use of models for crop protection, one the most often used for models are to design warning systems, to say, okay, maybe next week we will have a very strong development of aphids, or this disease will develop in a very important way. So if you are using pesticide, you can use that type of warning system in order to help you trigger pesticide applications. Another example is to help decision making with regard to biological control. If you want to control a given pest using some beneficial, you also need some modeling tools in order to optimize the timing and the quantity of the beneficial that you will be using. In a more interesting way, you can also use models in order to design agroecosystems that are less susceptible to pests. If you have enough knowledge to design agroecological crop protection strategies, then you can design models, and then you can have tools to say, okay, what if I'm doing these techniques with regard to this climate, or this type of soil, or this type of landscape, and it will help you design more reliant agroecosystems. We mentioned yesterday that if you use pesticide, you can get some resistances in the pest populations. Well, it's the same for cultivar resistance. If you spend a lot of money and time to select some cultivars with specific resistance, usually in a few years, you will see that this resistance is already overcome by the pest population. So you can use models in order to help you increase the durability of the resistances. At the landscape level, there are more interactions, and it's even more difficult. So you can also use models in order to help you design strategies in order to put the different crop species in a different time and space in order to limit contaminations amongst fields. You can also use models in order to adapt the cropping strategy in order to manage the architecture of your crop, because this architecture will modify microclimate and will modify pest development within this. So you can see that all these examples are just points of view to help manage the agroecosystems. In the field of plant breeding, you can design ideotypes in order to help you design sustainable strategy. You can perform yield loss analysis, so knowing what is the link between the symptoms or the injury and the loss that you will get in terms of quantity or quality. You can perform invasive species analysis. You can analyze the impact of climate change on pest development. You can assess various performances in terms of economic, environmental, and social performances of IPM strategies, for instance, or ACP strategies. And you can also use models in order to help design sampling strategies for monitoring the various pests. So you can see, and I think this list is not exhaustive. We have many examples on how we can use models for crop protections. Do you have any other examples in mind? Or do you think this covers the main use of models? I think it's quite exhaustive, but we can always think of some specific instances. So now we'll just show you some examples. So I don't know if in Vietnam you are using decision support systems for application of pesticide. I know that pesticides are very common in Vietnamese agriculture, but do you use any models in order to help trigger? Do you have any warning systems in Vietnam or not at all? No? So it's only based on observations, or is it based on the calendar saying, okay, it's Monday, I have to apply, and it's that way. So it used to be that way in the last century in France too, but since the 70s, 80s, some scientists designed decision support system in order to better adjust the treatment by pesticide. So this is very simple. Here you have a curve where you have, as a function of the time, the number of pests. So here you have the line that represents the pest development, and this dashed line is the pest population without any control. If you are higher than this economic injury level, it means that you will lose money if pest development is higher than this threshold. So you have here another threshold, which is the treatment threshold, saying, okay, if I'm higher than this threshold, then it's better for me to apply a given control in order to reduce the size of the population and to limit economic losses. So this is the basis for the concept of threshold for pesticide treatments, and you decide to treat only if the benefit of treatments is higher than the loss, the economic loss that will be created by the pest. Okay, it's the basic concept that was designed many years ago. Actually, if you are into that system, it's not the best way to reduce pesticide use, and it's better to go directly for ACP. It's my opinion, okay? But since we are dealing with model, I want to show you an historical perspective. And how this model works, it's always the same. You start with observations or an arbitrary start of the epidemic. Then you get an epidemiological model in a wide sense. It can be dealing with weeds, with insects, or with plant pathogens that are triggered by input variables. Usually it's soil and mostly weather variables that triggers these models. Then you have a damage model in order to assess the economic loss. And then you have recommendations, either to treat or to not treat, or just to wait and see. This is the logic that are used behind decision support systems. For that type of modeling approach, we can have a nice way to, under intensive crop management, with simplified tillage for all field. So in this simulation, the strategy is not really good to preserve the efficacy of resistance. And the second scenario is the same. We divide the landscape into type of fields, but we associate field with specific resistance to integrated crop management with plowing. Remember, to bury infected stubble, and 50% with a sustainable cultivar associated with simplified tillage. This is to reduce the selection pressure applied to the pathogen population. And you can see here the results of the models. You have the mean pathotype frequency. So at the beginning of the simulation, we still have 50% of the population which is avirulent against the specific resistance. And at the end, you can see after 5 years, all the pathogens lost their avirulence gene and became a virulent pathotype. For the second simulation, you can see that we get the same result for the last year, but the process seems to be slowed down by the cropping practices set up at the landscape level. So it's another example on how you can use model in order to define strategies, not only to limit pest development, but also to be careful with the changes over time of the genetic structure of the plant pathogen population. Okay? This type of modeling is more complex because you have to include cropping practices, you have to include landscape, crop sequence, the impact of each cropping practices on the disease development. You have to include the impact of weather on the spore dispersal at the landscape level, and take into account the genetic structure. Also, we have economic indicators, environmental indicators. So this type of model is quite a complicated model because we also have a crop model inside. This is the same question using another type of approach. It's called graph-based Markov decision process. For this talk, we don't go into technical details, so I think it's better to show other type of example. This is a much simpler model. If you need to analyze what is called yield losses, you can design this damage function. A damage function is the link between a severity or a symptom and the yield loss caused by these symptoms. Here you remember I showed you yesterday this disease. It's forma stem canker on oilseed rape or cannoli. And here you have a healthy plant, and here a plant totally destroyed by the fungus. And we use a disease index that ranges from 0 for a totally healthy crop to 9 for a crop totally destroyed by the fungus. And you can see that using some data sets, we were able to design a relationship between the level of injury and the relative yield loss. So that after, we are able to say, okay, with this disease index, I will have 10% of relative yield loss, for instance. Okay? So this is one of a very simple statistical model that can be used in order to define a threshold for pesticide application. Other use can be that type of models where, for instance, this is the case of an insect, potato tuber moth. And if you have a model, it's quite easy to use climate prediction as input to your model in order to say, okay, I have this prediction for the climate, and this will be the impact of climate change on the development of potato tuber moth. And in that way, you will get some priorities in order to decide fundings. If you're a research institute, you can say, okay, maybe in the future, this pest will be very important for our situations or for this continent, for instance. I had also this example on weeds, but it's just to show you that we have many type of modeling approaches. So just to conclude, I think that we overviewed a wide range of objectives for crop protections with regard to modeling. Behind that, we didn't have time to go into details of the techniques, but we will see later that we also have different type of techniques in order to design such models. With regard to ACP, agroecological crop protection, we saw that we have to take into account conservation biology, habitat management, preventive measures, and all these are quite complex with regard to modeling approach. And actually, things are much simpler if you are just using pesticide. You use a damage function, and you decide, okay, I apply or not my pesticide. And models, in that case, are not so difficult to design. For ACP, it's something more difficult. And the question that I ended up was, are usual modeling approaches adapted to agroecological crop protection? Because what I showed you were relatively simple examples. And for instance, when I showed you the example on cultivar resistance durability, beyond this, it's a very, very complex model. And so if we want to take into account the development of pests, the development of beneficials, that take into account cropping practices, the type of soil, and etc., we have a higher level of complexity, and certainly we have to change the way we have to address these modeling challenges. And this is why we came up with a very simple idea to say, okay, if we have to model a higher level of complexity, we should use simple methods in order to be able to address a wider scope of the system that we want to manage. And for those of you who don't like mathematics, it's a good news, because this approach is not based on a mathematical representation, but still you can perform simulations by doing so. So now we will have a different set of modeling projects that will use that type of innovative approach that really fit with the ACP approach, because we have a higher level of complexity, and also it's a very nice way of sharing information, not only among scientists, but also among scientists, advisors, and farmers even. Okay, and I think it's very important to keep in mind that in ACP we have this participatory approach, and it was nice to adapt also the modeling approaches in order to have a tool to gather farmers, advisors, and scientists around the table using a same modeling tool. So thank you very much for your attention. And,